You might be seeing a few headlines in the next few days that compare what's going on with the markets to back in that 2022 Liz Truss market meltdown, mini budget chaos era. And it's all feeling a bit scary at the moment. There's also going to be a word that's jumping around the place, which is gilts. It's basically a term for government bonds. And the way to think about gilts is like they're essentially the oil of a financial system engine. They're essentially important for making money flow from banks, from government into actually household income, because that's exactly what banks use to trade on. The government issues bonds to raise money. They act like an IOU or a promise of future payment. Now, the reason why we're paying so much attention to government bonds at the moment is because they're also the best indicator of how investors think about a budget and economy, and in this case, how Rachel Reeves has performed. Now, what we're seeing is that government bonds are suffering a very sharp sell-off at the moment. What people talk about is the government yield, the yield on a bond. Now, what yields are is basically the interest that investors demand for owning the government bonds. Yields rise when the price of a government bond falls because investors want more interest for holding what they think is a riskier asset. It's not a great sign that government bond prices are falling and yields are rising, and what's happening at the moment is that yield prices are actually rising back to that scary level of Liz Truss era, and in fact they're actually higher than that. Currently government bonds have been trading as high as 4.5% the yield. Back when it was Liz Truss it was 4.4%. So while government bond yields are currently trading higher than they were in the Liz Truss era, and we are hearing a lot about whether this is the same as Quamageddon, it is not like that, because government bonds were already trading a lot higher than they were in Liz Truss. The problem with the Liz Truss era was that it was the speed and the scale which government bond yields jumped up, which really caused pension funds to start dumping assets, and the Bank of England forced to step in. And it's worth noting that while sterling is falling, the value of the pound is falling slightly against the dollar and the euro. While the value of the pound also dropped when it was Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, the value of the pound almost crashed to being on parity with the dollar. We're nowhere near that. It's still the pound is still trading around 1.18 against the dollar, which is considerably higher. Now, this is exactly what Rachel Reeves didn't want when she was delivering her budget. In fact, she based her whole run-up to number 11 and the fact that she was the exact opposite to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. She talked about how she was securonomics, how she was fiscally responsible. But what investors are saying is something very different. In fact, they don't like the budget at all. They don't like the fact that she is borrowing so much. They don't like the fact that she's actually taking from private investors and household income and handing that to the public state, because generally the private investors are much better at spending money than the public investors are. You only have to look at HS2 for an example of that. Now, what we're seeing as well is that actually the budget watchdog gave a very severe warning that her spending that she was talking about invest and going for growth is actually going to result in lower growth at the end of Parliament. Not exactly what she wanted. There's also the warning that inflation is going to be higher, which means that interest rates aren't going to be falling as quickly as we thought either, because the Bank of England, while they might cut rates this month, they're not going to be cutting rates anywhere near as aggressively as we thought. Another major point that investors have an issue with is the fact that one of her biggest tax rates are on companies through the form of employers' national insurance contributions. This was her verbal gymnastics when she said she wasn't going to be taxing workers, but as it turns out, actually workers are going to be having lower income as a result, and households are also going to be worse off as well. So this budget is really kind of being punished on one side by bond investors who are saying, right, you told us that you were going for growth and you were going to be spending responsibly, and in fact you're raising so much extra debt, you're spending even more than we thought, and you're not going to be achieving growth. It's really important how the Chancellor behaves in the next few days. What actually happened in the Liz Truss era was markets got really spooked when Kwasi Kwarteng started talking about extra tax cuts coming. They thought that this was a sign that all hell was breaking loose and that they'd really lost their heads. How the Chancellor behaves and acts, and if she can restore calm to the markets, will be really important for the whole economy.